So we're going to have, ladies and gentlemen, a second panel on this theme of linking reconciliation to shared outcomes and changing the outcomes for Canada's Indigenous peoples. I'll introduce our three panelists, starting first with Peter Dinsdale. Peter is Anishinaabe and a member of the Curved Lake First Nation. He's currently Chief Executive Officer at the YMCA, but previously was Chief Executive Officer with the Assembly of First Nations, and prior to that, Director General of the National Association of Friendship Centers. We've also got Mike DeGagné, who is President and Vice Chancellor of Nipissing University. Mike has a background in the federal government in Indigenous programs and was a negotiator on comprehensive claims. Most recently, he served as the founding executive director of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. Mike is Order of Canada recipient, as well as the Order of Ontario and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal. And last but certainly not least, we have Terry Goodtrack. He is currently the President and Chief Executive Officer of AFOA Canada. He, prior to that, was Chief Operating Officer of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, served as CEO of the Indigenous Gaming Regulators Incorporated, and had prior positions as Chief Financial Officer for both the FSIN and the Assembly of First Nations. And he's a courageous young man and has agreed to speak first. So, Terry?
So, is this, oh yeah, okay, it's on. First, I'd like to recognize we're on the Algonquin territory here this morning / afternoon. And the reason why I wanted to go first is because I didn't want to be outshone by these awesome orators here, right? That's going to come after me. So, I get to the point first. I guess when I was asked to speak on this subject, right? Thinking about nation-to-nation building, I'm a strong proponent of institutions, Aboriginal institutions, Indigenous institutions, and how they play in terms of the nation-to-nation building. And so I'll speak of ours because a lot of people don't know about, especially in government, about AFOA Canada, right? So at one time we were originally called the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association of Canada, and recently we've modified our name to AFOA Canada, and I'll explain the reason why. But back in 1999, AFOA was created, AFOA Canada, and it was very much a community-led process. And I always say this when I present at the Chiefs and Assembly is, we were created by the Assembly of First Nations, right? And we are what I call an Indigenous institution. We have, aside from our head office, which is here in Ottawa, we have 9 chapters across the country, right, from British Columbia through to Atlantic and up to, we just in fact established a new one in Nunavut, which we're just getting up and running. What we do is we're a membership organization. So we have March 31st, 2016, we have 1,508 members across the country. We have 34 corporate members. We have a corporate membership strategy as well. We do what I call certifications to broader certifications. So we have this thing called the Certified Aboriginal Financial Manager Designation. And our target market for that is directors of finance and their successors. And we align that certification up with CPA Canada. So the idea is people will go through our designation that are working in communities and that kind of thing to heighten sort of the level of finance and management in Indigenous communities, which is one of the main reasons why AFOA Canada was started in the first place. That cause is as important 18 years ago as it is today. Then our second designation, which we recently embarked upon, which is about 3 or 4 years ago, is called the Certified Aboriginal Professional Administrator. And the target market for that is our First Nation administrators, band managers, CEOs, EDs, and their successors. And what we do is we align that with universities. So, as an example, with Nipissing here University or the Cape Breton University, so to enter their degree programs as well as their MBA programs. So it's one of these, designations to a broader designation. And then recently we've just launched. We did all sort of the, competency profile and finalizing the program on an elected leader certification, which is designed to do community governance, and then we're aligning it with the Directors College at a McMaster to do the corporate governance if they so choose, these individuals and so forth. So once we got into these other designations, we have to change our name from Aboriginal Financial Officers Association, right, to AFO Canada, because people who are taking these other designations have to be able to see themselves, within the broader title, right, sort of the title of the organization. So that's who we are. We have chapter events, and we have a national conference that we hold every annually. In fact, it was last week in Calgary. And our upcoming one will be, coming up on October 2nd to the 5th, 2017 in Vancouver, British Columbia. We typically bring about, 1,000 people to that conference. In fact, if you measure it by numbers, it's 1,150 we had in Calgary. So it's certainly, I could say growing, sort of a growing conference and so forth, and a lot of good content, I thought, there, as well as networking opportunities and people having this sense of community, right? We, when you get to the notion of outcomes and that kind of thing, right? We actually have at our conference every week try to get together. We have a breakfast meeting. It happens to be on a Thursday at 7 a.m. It's the only time really available during the conference. But we try to bring together our corporate partners and audit firms and universities in resource industries and sort of other sort of players to see how do we increase Indigenous accountants in Canada, right? I mean, we have our CFM. We have 596 CFMs that we've granted over that 18-year period. But when we take a look at the broader designation of CPAs, one of my tasks over the last 2 years was to identify, how many Indigenous CPAs there are, right? And there's no list, there is no, and it's all self-identification. So you have to, speak to people like Harold here and so forth and say, who do we have, right? And I've got a list of approximately 60 people, right? And, if Brenda LaRose was here, she would say, well, it's really 100, right? So I certainly have to crosswalk with her numbers and people and that kind of thing. But, you sit there and you think, okay, how many should there be? What is the actual goal of this, right? And our goal, is to ensure that certainly we have one in every community of the broader designation. And why would that be? Well, that would be because, I always say this, which our CFM program is, if a community is fully funded, 100% funded, our CFM is very relevant to that, right? Or a nonprofit and so forth like that. But once you get into the economic development corporations and you have to do consolidations, right? I.e., put it all together, right? Then you really need a CPA that's in that organizations, right? So, to improve sort of the finance and management in the communities as they evolve into what I call higher performing communities, we certainly need this sort of strength at the financial level, but also the management level. The another initiative that we work on is financial literacy, right? Heavily, most of what we do is financial literacy, and earlier this week we had a meeting with the National Steering Committee on Financial Literacy, right? So Harold and I were there, right? And you sit there, what's the goal there, right? When you talk about outcomes, well, we could certainly play a big part in terms of both what I call personal financial literacy, but also First Nation government financial literacy, right? And there's a lot of transfer value between the two. But in the personal financial literacy, what are we trying to do, right? Is you're trying to, and statistics show that our Indigenous people have a lower level of financial literacy than Canadians, and Jane Rooney points that out all the time, and it's one of the main focuses of this of our upcoming work in the next 2 years. But what are we trying to do? So the outcome really is, how do we get more people into the middle class from the lower class, right? I mean, through things like, building wealth, and I say that, well, nobody tells you how to build wealth, right? It's something you kind of stumble into, or you get an investment advisor and that kind of thing, right? And they say, there's a statistic that says 49% of the average Canadian's wealth is in real estate, right? Your home or whatever, right? Well, for First Nation people living on a reserve, it's a band-owned house, right? So on some reserves there's market value, on other reserves there's nothing, right? So that big element there on building wealth is not necessarily there, right? So are there different strategies on building wealth and getting people, Indigenous people, more into the middle class, I think, and I think that's a really important sort of goal going forward on outcomes, and for sort of what I call government financial literacy. It's that notion of building, as communities grow, is ensuring these trust funds are there, that you have funds for future generations, right? And in fact, we just at our last conference signed an MOU with Harvard University on a 4-day executive program on investment governance, negotiations, and change management, and that is going to be offered to our members in terms of, so that they can, be the latest ideas from a really top-ranked university in the world, right? And I think that's a really important thing to do, and we're working with our sister organization in the States called AFOA. And I think the last point that I'll make within my 5 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever it is governance. So, I recall sitting on this. There used to be this corporate secretary organization in Toronto, right? So after I got my director certification, they asked me to sit on this panel about diversity on corporate boards, and it was an interesting conversation, I thought, because the diversity on corporate boards is being viewed very much as women on corporate boards, right? That's the diversity, and I keep saying, well, I mean, that's great, but that's not what I view as the end stop on this, right? Like, diversity is all of these other players: minorities, Indigenous, Canadians, disabled, and so forth, right? You can't just stop at women to make up the diversity on these boards. So when I think about our governance training for community governance, and then go forward with corporate, it's an important element for our elected leaders to make that transition, because when that diversity comes on the corporate boards, and they're trying right now, I am sure what's going to happen is there's going to be this requirement to have these type of certifications, right? So we want to make sure that our people are ready to take those positions on the bigger boards, and there already are Indigenous people on those boards, like Keith Martell's on Potash Corp and so forth, right? But I think it's really key to have these certifications, so that barrier, I would call it, is eliminated, right? Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Michael? Yeah, absolutely.
Very much. There's a saying here that where you sit is where you stand, and so it won't surprise you that will have something to say about universities as a model for your consideration. The question that we have is to take a look at our relationships that are using recognition and accommodation, and find out how that might contribute to shared outcomes. I will say that with respect to reconciliation and linking reconciliation in, sometimes I hear that people will say, well, how can we have reconciliation if we have no conciliation in the first place? But I don't know that that's true. We have to go back a long way before a time when we were in a relationship that was equal and meaningful, and that I would probably go back to the description of the famous Royal Proclamation in 1763. And the words of that proclamation, of course, defined a relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people as equal, respectful. You own this, I own this, and if we need aid, we will come to each other's mutual aid upon request. And I think the last 250 years has seen an erosion of that conciliation, of that relationship, through the treaties, through the residential schools, through all of the things that have befallen Aboriginal people as we went from equal partners in the military and trade to wards of the crown. And now, through, I think, in the last decades, I think we'd all agree that there's been a certain resurgence in the idea that we're moving back towards a positive and equal relationship. We're going to matter again. Our participation matters as people in both the Canadian economy, in governments, in the welfare for all Canadians. So this is in a sense what it is that we're trying to demonstrate, is that we matter. Universities are a funny place, or a funny model for demonstrating recognition and accommodation. It's not the landscape that you'd first think about. It's not an understatement to say that Aboriginal people, having come out of 100 years of the residential schools, are a little leery of the process of formal education. And I think we can also say that universities are and have been and remain fundamentally assimilative places. I have friends who used to go into the public service and they would say, I'm going into the public service as an Aboriginal person so that I can change the system from the inside. Well, usually after a decade in the public service, you come out and you are the person who has been changed. You've been taught in a way to think differently, to act differently, and to see the world in a different way. And universities are the same thing. People go in for 4 years or 6 years or 8 years, and they come out and they haven't changed the university much. The 5 oldest institutions in the world are universities. They've been around for centuries and they don't change much. But at the same time, these old, staid institutions are redefining a relationship with Aboriginal people. We are recognizing the importance of Aboriginal people, that Aboriginal people matter, and we are making accommodations. How are we doing that? Well, no one can sustain actions towards reconciliation just because of some sort of moral obligation or ethical obligation. We generally don't do that. We do it because of some self-interest. We are self-interested as institutions, as universities, in reaching out to the Aboriginal population. The Aboriginal population is young, largely undereducated. They represent enormous numbers of young people who can benefit from education, and we want them in our institutions. We want them to come. And so Aboriginal people are in a really unique, especially Aboriginal youth, are in a really unique position these days, where all of these universities and colleges and training schools and institutions are coming to court them, to say, you know, you really should come and see us. We'd really like to have you. We have scholarships available for you. We want you to be in our institutions. And that is transforming the way universities do their business. The process of indigenization. So across the university sector, not just bringing in Aboriginal students and saying, it's great you're here, here's an Aboriginal center for you. We have programs if you need some help, either financially or academically, all of those there are for you. Something different is happening. And that something different is that in each class, whether it's math, whether it's science, whether it's the arts, people are weaving into the curriculum Indigenous ideas, Indigenous worldviews, making a place where maybe the dominant Western academic view isn't the only thing in the end of it all. So we're changing the way that we teach not just Indigenous students that come into the institutions, but all students that come into the institutions to accommodate and recognize the value of Aboriginal people in our system. This is tremendous. And I think it helps both Indigenous students and it helps the institutions. One of the difficulties, of course, is that we have large numbers of Aboriginal students coming through our front door, but many fewer that are leaving with degrees. We have to focus on the success of our students, not just getting them to the institution in the first place. And that's part of our are accommodating, and part of our indigenizing of the institution. So that's the model that I would hold out for you, is the model of the modern university. And you might say, and I imagine many of you work for government, that, well, that's great for universities, but we really can't do it in the government context. We can't really begin to indigenize all of our departments and the way we do our work. I don't know that you can do that, but you can certainly adopt a training model that is, I think, more transformative for Aboriginal people who want to become part of civil society and do government work. I was really pleased to know that Scott Serson, my deputy from Indian Affairs back in the day, was here moderating this panel, because it was under his leadership in the mid-90s that I was given access to a particular program for personal and professional development. And that required the exact wording that we see in this program: recognition and accommodation. I was identified, along with a group of others, by Mr. Serson and others. I was accommodated in that I was taken off the line and sent to specialized training programs to develop leadership skills and executive skills. And I was, my own graduate studies were supported by the department. And at the end of the day, it didn't require a grand plan. It required a force of will. And what I'm calling on here is for the public sectors and for what little Aboriginal civil society we have to be transformative in its commitment going forward in the next little while to capacity development and training for Aboriginal people. It's the best way to recognize the kind of potential that we have out there, and the best way to set ourselves up for the future so that we have people in place who can do the work of governance. I don't need to tell the Institute on Governance how much call there is for governance training in First Nations communities. Everyone is interested and involved. We need more people out there. What's interesting, I found, as I was traveling from the West this week, and I stopped off briefly in two different airports, and both times I met now retired colleagues from Indian Affairs who had been through the same programming as I was, that Mr. Serson created back in the mid-90s. And I talked to them in the airport, and I said, "So what are you up to? What are you doing?" And he says, the first guy said, "I'm going home because my band wanted me to chair their annual general meeting for a couple days." The second stop I made in Winnipeg, I met another guy, same circumstances, and he said, "I was asked to come home to manage my band's election." 20 years ago, we were in the same program. 20 years later, the fruits of those investments in young Aboriginal talent are now starting to show themselves. And I know that when we talk about public sector investment in Aboriginal talent and leadership, it's always part of the strategic plan of any department. But what I'm saying is that it should be first. We should move this up on our agenda. We should transform the system, make uncommon and significant resource investments in the education of Aboriginal people that are coming into our system. And I'll say it, and I know you've been saying it for many years, Scott, that the end to all of this is the creation of a vibrant, capable, and well-educated Aboriginal public service. That's our end goal, and I believe that's the way we're going to get to true reconciliation. Thank you.
Bojo, Peter Dinsdale, being Adishnakas, Wabejeje and Dodem, Korth and Ishnabe and Dunjaba, Badaw and Dodness. That's my personal reconciliation, by the way. That's my broken Ojibwe that I'm learning and trying to reconciling ourselves in our own communities. I'd like to acknowledge the Algonquin people for allowing us to gather on their territory. and acknowledge, I know there's some chiefs and some knowledge keepers here, acknowledge them, and thank IOG for inviting me and providing an opportunity to speak and share some thoughts on reconciliation and shared outcomes. I'm going to do this presentation in 2 bits, if you don't mind. I'm going to do a bit on my formal role, and then we're going to full stop and then go into a different presentation about some personal views on this, if you'll allow me, all within the time frame. I should acknowledge, by the way, that one of my mentors is here, Richard Jock, who was I worked with originally at the Assembly of First Nations. I came as Chief Operating Officer, and he ushered me along. And Grand Chief Mike Mitchell was so transformative and informative in the work that I did at the time there. I made a bit of list because I don't want to forget anyone. Joe Muskokum, acknowledge you, and the work that we did together when I was at the AFN. Mike DeGagné, I was reflecting when Sean Elliott was National Chief, you were installed at Nipissing, and I remember going to your ceremony. I think you were the first, are you the first Indigenous president at a major university in Canada? So we have a real trailblazer here among us, and I know among his many accomplishments, that's one that should certainly be acknowledged while we're here. So, I'm currently the president and CEO at YMCA Canada. I started there in June, a little over a year ago, and this is one of my first public speaking events on Indigenous issues, so it was kind of fun to think about it a little bit and to think about the work that's happening. But I want to tell you, just because I'm at YMCA, I haven't forgotten about the issues here, and I'm bringing that work to the YMCA. I first got engaged with the YMCA when Scott Haldane was the chair of the education panel. When I first started the AFN, I got to know Scott in that work. After the education panel, Scott and I worked together and we started this 4Rs initiative. He asked me to bring together First Nation, Métis, and Inuit youth together, and he would bring National Youth Serving Agencies youth together and get them in the same room and get it out of the way. And out of that came this 4Rs initiative, currently being run by Jessica Bolduc. If you're unaware, it's a wonderful program. You should find yourselves engaged in it. But so I continued to work with Scott, and then YMCA Canada had this idea that they would extend their board members to have external members come. So they came and approached me, asked if I'd be willing to be one of the first 3 external board members of YMCA Canada. So I jumped at the chance, and then 2 years later, Scott took a different role, and through a series of unfortunate events, I found myself at YMCA Canada. So it's a great journey. It's my first time in my career. I've never worked in government. I'm almost proud to say, I guess, after what you just said, Mike, but it's my first time working in a non-Indigenous organization. And throughout I worked at friendship centers and on my way up through the AFN and then to here. So it's been a real interesting experience, but they're all very kind people at YMCA's. They're very left of center, very caring, and it's a different environment, but it's certainly enjoyable. One of the things that really attracted me to YMCA Canada is they have this bold ambition. I think it's a bit hubris, and I tell them that, and they giggle at me. They say they're working towards the Canada they want and the YMCA they need. So the Canada they want means many things. It means diversity, it means inclusion, it means providing services to the most impoverished communities, and it means reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. In 1946, John Mott, who was at the time the General Secretary of the International YMCA movement, won the Nobel Peace Prize. Actually won half the Nobel Peace Prize if you Google it. But anyway, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1946. And he won it for their work in World War I and World War II, where YMCA's actually were in the front lines, providing refugee services and relief to soldiers on both sides of the battles. And it made me question, what is the scale of our ambition today? Are YMCA's the kind of organization that are on the front lines in Northern Africa as people are fleeing warring regimes? Or are they meeting migrants as they leave their boats in Southern Europe? We're not there. What's the equivalent in Canada? What are the most pressing public policy issues that an organization like the YMCA can take leadership in? And we're happen to be in our strategic planning process, so I have a bit of pull and influence on where we're going. So there's 2 areas that we're really going to focus in on here. The first is newcomers, 40,000 refugees, 300,000 more coming across the country. There's a tremendous amount of work needed there. The second is Indigenous peoples and reconciliation. So there are some bright lights out there, work that's already happening. In Calgary, they have a drum and dance program where they go into public schools with YMCA Canada, YMCA staff, teach 6, 7, 8-year-olds regalia making and powwow dancing. If you can think about 6, 7, and 8-year-olds in a city like Calgary and the kind of issues they face from identity and all the background and legacies that we have, that's a really informative and transformative program that they're taking on their own. Number 2 First Nations opening up a YMCA on reserve. I'm going there next week to be a part of the ribbon cutting ceremony. I know there's other communities in Ontario that are looking at doing the exact same thing. In Hamilton, YMCA staff go onto Six Nations into the school program and do after-school programs with kids in their communities. Where YMCAs can lead, and we'll be partners with you on a policy and advocacy basis and on the work that we're doing, we will be partners with you moving forward. So there's more of that to come. Watch for it, and we're going to continue to work for the Canada we want, but also the YMCAs we need. So that's the end of my first presentation. And now, completely unauthorized, this is the part I had more fun with. Look, I came into the room and I saw the knowledge keepers and people from these communities. So I'm not going to talk about the Tuor Wampum, but I want to use it as a metaphor for the nature of the treaty relationship. This workshop, as I saw, was shared outcomes, nation building and rebuilding. My panel is linking reconciliation to shared outcomes. So what are we reconciling? And I heard that question a bit in some of the earlier concepts. The two-row wampum belt beautifully, for me, illustrates the nature of the treaty relationship. Going parallel in the same direction. Not crossing into each other's paths, not going to each other's canoes, going in our own direction parallel. This was a founding vision, I believe, in all of our treaties. It's been articulated different. It's been articulated in different ways. But this, for me, is the foundation of the treaty relationship. My community, Curve Lake, is a signatory of 3 treaties. 1818 is the Postage Stamp Treaty. It's treaty number 20. It's illustrated there. Not long after War of 1812, we heard some of those reflections earlier. 1856 was a bigger version of Treaty 20, took up more territory. And then after the numbered treaties, they came back and signed the Williams Treaty of 1923. But what did it mean in 1818 for Curve Lake, or that community, to sign a treaty? What was the intention? What was their vision for the country? What was their vision of a shared future? Was the vision that we would grow and expand and live as Anishinaabe people in parallel, like the Tuor Wampum talked about? Or is the vision the kind of subjection that took place certainly later on? Now the challenge is we go to the text of the treaties, we know that these aren't always the most helpful. We know from treaty commissioners' diaries and other evidence we have, what they told our leaders of the day and what they ended up signing were fundamentally different documents. But at its core, I believe, that settler people signed treaties with original nations to envision a new future. As they went across the country, this is the spirit and intent that we brought to the treaties that were signed. Now, whatever the original vision of the treaties were, our shared history, and this isn't an education experience, you know this better than I do. Dr. Marie Wilson's here. She spent a great portion of her life helping us all understand this, that the behavior moving forward was repugnant. Whether it was residential schools and their sad stories, or as a forced relocation out of communities, is a banning of ceremonies, all these things together are a different colonial history that we're just starting to think about reconciling. We witnessed through the signing of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement an idea of a different future. Brave survivors telling their stories. And you know, I think it wasn't out of any goodwill the government of Canada woke up one day and thought, you know what we should do is we should reconcile. You know, we feel bad about this history that we had. There were court cases. This was a settlement agreement. Canada settled rather than be embarrassed. And out of that settlement agreement came a number of provisions, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What was critical, of course, is that survivors had an opportunity to tell their stories. You can't settle and have the history go away. So we had statement gathering, we had this entire history that brought us here. And it was that good work that opened the minds, I think, of many Canadians, that brought us back to the work we're doing here. And across the country, as I work in mainstream now, it's amazing how much mainstream Canadians really want to dig deep in this and see what they can do to help us move forward. But again, what exactly are we reconciling? Currently, we're governed by the Indian Act. Different versions of the Indian Act. Perhaps you signed a new treaty to get out of the Indian Act, but this is the prevailing piece of legislation that tells us how we're to operate. That's a vision of a clan system governance from the Union of Ontario Indians and Anishinaabe. If we're going to reconcile, we have to reconstitute what was taken away from us. These governing systems, our language. In my example, to live as Anishinaabe, to care for our families, our resources, and our territories. But we say we're going to reconcile as nations, What do you mean by nations? I don't think we should get too hung up on this, by the way. The one map is on the far side is the treaties, the map of the treaties that are in Canada. The map that's closest to me is based on nation affiliation. Our cap, I think, said it was 59 nations. I should have wrote it down. In and around that number. So are we going to have 59 nations reconstituted, or are we going to let Treaty 4 be Treaty 4, which are a conglomeration of different nation groups? I'm agnostic. Ask the communities themselves. How do you want to be recognized? Under the Education Act work, and you know, it wasn't perfect by no means, the vision is that you would let Treaty 4 develop a Treaty 4 Education Authority, and you let the Anishinaabe develop an Anishinaabe Education Authority, and both can live together symbiotic. We don't need a perfect, beautiful solution. We need to ask communities how do they see themselves organized and work and facilitate them to do it. So what's the path forward? We have the Chicoltan fighting for Aboriginal title in cases in courts, and we've won. You know, Bill Gallagher will tell you the number of court decisions we've won. We had the Charlottetown Accord, a consensus agreement until, of course, it went for referendum that talked about the fundamental changes that we need to have in this country. My personal view is that we're going to continue on this struggle path we have until we fix the foundations of the government that we have. First Nations need to be recognized as a distinct order of government. Until then, our First Nations will be continued to be funded by things like transfer payment agreements, contribution agreements. The same thing for Winterlude Festival is funding our education systems and communities. That is not reconciliation. That is continuous on the subjection of the Indian Act. See, this one was more fun than my other one did. So, this is my last slide. So, the only shared outcome, if that's what the name of this panel is to reverse what this picture was meant to show during the residential school area. Taking a beautiful young man in his regalia and think of everything that goes into it. Think of where he was born. Think of his upbringing. Think of the nation that he lived in. Think of the culture that he lived in. Think of how he lived day to day as an Indigenous person to what they wanted us to become. The only way we'll have shared outcomes and reconciliation is when we reverse that image. When we allow us as Anishinaabe people, as Haudenosaunee, to live as they want to live, govern themselves as they want to be governed in a federation they recognize. Thank you very much.
Well done. Okay, so 3 very different presentations, 3 perspectives. Questions, comments from the floor?
Hi, Karen Jacobs-Williams. I work at INAC, and I worked with Mike DeGagné. I don't say for, we say with, because we all work together. It was a great experience. Mike, you talked about accommodation, and I find that at INAC, and I thought my tombstone would read it, she never worked for Indian Affairs. So that's not going to work for me. Anyhow, we have a lot of First Nation people working at the department who are all in lower level jobs because they don't speak French. And I think that they should at least be, and a lot of them, I mean, if they want to learn French, that's fine, that's wonderful. I think a second language, a third language is great. But we have these employees who speak several Indigenous languages, and they're not given bilingual bonuses. They're not given any recognition for what they have, for what they bring to the department. I find that atrocious and so sad. I guess it's more of a comment or a rant, and I have a hard time with the department and that thinking. I mean, I worked in NGOs almost my whole life, and I had people under me. I had management skills. Nothing of that sort is recognized because I don't speak French. I speak some Mohawk, not fluent, but anyway, I just think that the department has to accommodate us more than it's done, and recognize people. And thank you, Mr. Serson, for recognizing these wonderful gentlemen. Thank you.
Does Anybody want to comment on that? I'm going to steer clear.
Well, Karen, I thought we were friends. No, the last thing I'm going to comment on is the official languages policy in government. But I think, you know, when you look back on some of the milestone speeches in our community, you know, you look back in the Lament for Confederation by Chief Dan George, and he said, you know, just give me the tools of your society and we will become the most productive part of it, right? So I think not everything about service in government is roses. Certainly not for Aboriginal people, but there are elements of it that we can take and run with that we can benefit from now and apply to our communities. There were elements of my service in Indian Affairs that you know, it was more like Indian Affairs University or Indian Affairs Finishing School. There were elements of, you know, teaching about, you know, planning, strategy, implementation, all of these sorts of things that I have taken great benefit from. So I think in a lot of ways we can't fix the whole system, but there are elements of government service that we can apply to our own communities that make I think government service more of a learning experience than and we should treat it that way.
Gary, go
Just add, I guess, a bit to what Mike's saying. Not to get to the official languages policy either, but you know, I had the opportunity to work in government for 10 years, and for Mike and certainly for Scott. And I'll never forget when I first went to government, it was about 1989, and they had this, I guess it was sort of a cross-cultural training. Everybody had to go, all new employees had to go there. But there's a gentleman by the name of Blaine Fable, and Blaine's worked in, you know, sort of the political sort of sphere as well, Indigenous political sphere, as well as, you know, he lives in Calgary. He ran a company out there. And we had him as actually our keynote speaker last year in Montreal. But I remember him speaking. He said, and he talked about this picture. And he said, you know, there's this picture about this, you know, when I guess the English came over and that kind of thing, and you know, and the shaking of hands and that kind of thing, and the idea of discovery, right, was the thing that, you know, discovered America and that kind of thing. But then he would point out, okay, well, who's this other guy that's here in this picture, which is an Indigenous, probably a Mi'kmaq person, right? Well, who's this person? Why isn't that person being recognized, right? And it gets to that whole point of two founding nations, right? And why we have the English, the French, and I think the official languages policy and that kind of thing. But I think one of the biggest, like, important things that I think the Assembly could do, and I know National Chief Bellegarde speaks about it, is the recognition of the First Nations, right, as a founding nation, as the founding nation, right? And because it changes everything that's taught in schools and mindsets, right? So that is a really, really important, I think, part of this idea of recognition, right? So, you know, I think it's key.
This question's for Peter. We were talking about how mainstream Canada wants to become involved in reconciliation and discussions, and I've noticed the same thing. There's a lot of interest in it. What tools do you think organizations like mainstream organizations, or what tools do you think would be of use to ensure those conversations happen?
If I knew that, I'd be a rich consultant. I think the truth is, and to be frank, and you know, we're among friends in this community, First Nations can be difficult folks to work with. There's no shortage of do-gooder organizations that are contacting us, wanting to engage. People get influxed. You know, what is and whose benefits are these relationships meant to serve? Are they meant to serve our communities or serve their own benefits? So I acknowledge there's a lot of hesitation to engage. When mainstream organizations talk to me about it, I certainly talk about the need to build a relationship. I mean, don't invite them out and ask them for something on day one. Take some time to kind of do it, but also make sure that the community is benefiting. It just can't be for, you know, the YMCA's benefit in this example. It has to be for others. And I think it's about personal relationships in a lot of ways. I know there's some YMCA camps that are trying to have reconciliation in the name of their camps, the name of their buildings, where the territories they're in. So I'm actually trying to facilitate meetings with chiefs and elders in communities and suggesting a path forward, because these folks have no idea how to go about it. And my experience is if they don't know how to go about it, they need help. They need navigators in some respect to find ways to make respectful relationships. So I don't really think there's a toolkit as much as there's a process, and that process I think is about a respectful engagement with them and taking some time. So.
Hi there. My name is Nicole Beaks. I'm a law student at the University of Ottawa, and witnessing the I've also been a public servant in several different departments, but my question is more directed towards Dr. DeGagné, and certainly comment by the others is welcome as well. But how do you prevent, in the process of recognition, how do you prevent, or meaningful recognition, how do you prevent the process of indigenization from becoming another form of neocolonialism? And I'm a non-Indigenous ally, so I'm always looking for ways to contribute, but it's something our school's going through right now in trying to have meaningful engagement that's not tokenized or just paying lip service, especially when you have policies harkening back to the earlier question of bilingualism. And when I say bilingualism, I mean the Official Languages Act. But how do you do that in a way that ensures it's meaningful and not just creating more problems and resulting in a pan-indigeneity?
Well, thank you for that question, and that has occurred already, not just here locally in universities or law schools, but in other schools I know where people have Aboriginal students have stepped forward and said, "Look, I appreciate that I'm being taught a course on Indigenous peoples, but it's wrong. It doesn't resonate with my own experience or the history that I've been taught." So these things are driven by a good intent, but in a lot of cases they miss the mark in the implementation. That's probably why so many institutions in Canada, and there's 97 universities across the country, they're all looking for highly qualified Indigenous scholars to become part of the faculty to drive an agenda authentically. And if you wanted a job doing well right now, become an Indigenous scholar, and universities will come calling, line up at your door. So everyone is looking for that authenticity and to try and avoid that colonization all over again. Sometimes you have to just introduce a tool into the system and then have everyone discuss it. And one of the things that we did, for example, I know others have done, is a common book program, where every first-year student reads the same book. In our case, it was on residential schools and reconciliation. And then we have a discussion where the faculty is encouraged to weave the contents of that book into every course that's taught across the university, not just one course on Indigenous issues, but across the institution. And that way you might encounter some of those elements in history, geography, science courses. And then people are encouraged to discuss it. And we're also encouraged to discuss it in not in a confrontational way, but not in a comfortable way either. A lot of the discussions that occur in the university sector now, people say, I don't want to talk about this because I don't feel safe, or I'm uncomfortable. You should feel safe, but the whole point of university is to feel uncomfortable, and so those are the kinds of things that we're trying to promote. That's a good question. Thank you.
Yes, I just thank you very much to all the panelists. Just I'd like to make a couple of comments. It might turn into a question, I'm just not sure. But what I'm really struck by is, from the governance perspective and from university perspective, the push to try to get people to measure up within those existing structures. And I touched on this in my own presentation, but I think the challenge for us is to get far more humble about what expertise might look like, and that it doesn't necessarily speak this language over that language. It doesn't necessarily have this degree versus these 25 years of lived experience, that things like that. And I think within universities, apart from the good work that is being done, and I'm aware of a lot of the things at your university, Mike, and other places where people are trying to introduce new things. But I just lived through recently a model at McGill with a professor of practice, and I don't know how common that is across the universities, but it really zeroes in on experiential assets as opposed to this or that specific academic level. Must be a doctorate in order to teach this or that. And I think we need far more bold experimentation around that. I think we need it as a way of recognizing the expertise that we have in land management from people who've lived on the land all these years, in the area of linguistics from people who have been fluent speakers and never gone to a post-secondary school in their lives, of people who know all kinds of things about the anatomy of an animal, having lived with them, but are not biologists or ever going to pass a test as a surgeon, and yet they may know far more about the inner workings of big animals than any doctor. So I'm not suggesting a specific thing, except that I think we have to get way beyond trying to find solutions that have to do with indigenizing what already exists, and that talk about rethinking what do we value as expertise in our country, how do we measure that, and how do we reward it. And particularly, if I may say, on the issue of language, we had long talks about this within the commission, because one of the most recurring messages of devastation was loss of language, not only from survivors, but from their children and grandchildren. And I think one of the things that we could do, and I know it can be done because in the Northwest Territories we forced a recognition of the official language status of Indigenous languages a long time ago. I used what authority I had in my workplace to push it and to give equal recognition to people who spoke Indigenous languages as was granted to people who spoke French. And so it can be done, and you might get in trouble for it, but welcome the trouble, because it provokes the conversation. And I think we have to try to do that. And maybe we do it on some case studies and some pilot projects and so on, but we've got to at least start. Because I think finessing our way of doing the status quo is not going to advance us.
It's very helpful. Mike, do you want to comment on that? No, you don't have to.
No. That was a good comment.
Any other questions?
Good morning. I've been listening for the last day and a half here, listening to how things are evolving and that. I think that we're talking about a certain level of authority, but we're not really talking about authority. What we're talking about is a discourse that's steeped in Canadian values, which are not really Indigenous values. You got education over here, and then you have our traditional belief in that. And there's a wall in between that. And that wall is romanticism. It's mysticism. And we don't know how to jump that wall. We have to look beyond what that wall is, because there's parallels here. And they have to work in congruence with each other. Or else we're still going to be having this debate in 5 years from now, 10 years from now. The debate will never stop. Because what is being suggested here is a level of authority. And that really shouldn't exist like that. If we're going to accept a level of authority, it means we have to be responsible. So we have to gain a certain amount of responsibility. Because we can all be responsible, but if we don't have the ability to respond to what's being asked of us, then we're not really doing too much other than having nice meetings. Certainly I agree with a lot of what's being said here, but I think a lot of times we're trying to, in traditional ways, we would say you're jumping the fire. You only got a little bit of knowledge and you want to jump the fire to the other side. And I think a lot of times we're either scared to jump the fire or we jump the fire too quickly, without learning a lot of the necessary tools that are needed. I think that was the only comment I wanted to make right at the moment here. But it's really important that we, just going over my notes here, that we understand what our oral competence is, because like our culture, our data, and our knowledge, it's all there in our stories. But how many of us really know our stories from where we've grown up? We sort of put them aside to, well, that's our traditions, that's our culture, that's nice, but hey, I got to learn an education here and become somebody that's important and becomes responsible. But we don't learn our responsibilities to talk back to the people that we were come from. And that's just my observations for today. I don't know if I'm asking a question, but that's my observations.
Thank you. Anybody want to comment?
I could comment. I think you're right. I like the idea that we have to have the capacity to respond, and I think when we talk about recognition and accommodation, that's also two-way, and I think there's visible ways in which mainstream institutions and governments, etc., are working to understand how to recognize Aboriginal worldviews and understandings and knowledge, and then accommodate, whether that's the justice system, with the oral tradition, oral testimony, and these sorts of things. But at the same time, I think we also see that goes the other way, and that we as an Aboriginal community need to accommodate and to recognize that we live in a different world now, and that we have to make sure that the views that we hold and the knowledge that we have can be somehow translated into something that the broader society understands. So I think that this response that you're talking about and the sharing of knowledge goes two ways, and that both sides have to accommodate and to recognize that something different has to happen. That we know. If nothing different happens, then you're right. It's just nice meetings.
Yes, please.
I wonder if our nations would be ready if Trudeau got up in the House tomorrow and said the Indian Act will be gone in a year. Some will, some won't be ready. What are we going to replace it with? Right? With what? Are we ready for the new fiscal relationship? Are we ready for our own traditional forms of governance? Do we have the systems and structures in place? When I was at AFM, when we talked about getting rid of the Indian Act, when Sean Atleo said in 5 years, let's get ready to get away from the Indian Act, they said, what replaces it? We're not ready. I'm not sure we've done the real work to get ready, even today. So I know when I say, we need reconciliation means getting back to the traditional forms of governance, I think, the speaker, the question was absolutely right. We're not ready. We haven't done that work. And I think that's what forums like this are good for. The work that Terry's doing is getting us ready, but we have a lot of work to do. There's no question.
No, I remember when we, before the National Center for First Nation Governance closed, I was on the board for a while. And we always had these discussions about traditional governance and what that means, right? And I remember when we started our board meetings and all that kind of stuff, we got the Roberts rules out and all this wonderful stuff. And, you'd sit there and you say, okay, if we're going to be really talking about governance in First Nation communities, we better at our level be able to figure out how does that work on an actual board, right? Instead of espousing this. So we, what we ended up doing was we said, okay, well, if it's based on consensus, let's actually act that way, right? Let's move to that model. Now, having said that, even at that point, we had to recognize at the end of the day, if someone, on the board was decided for whatever reason not to participate, right, or had another different agenda, there still had to come down to a vote, right? But it was interesting how when we had adopted that model, of consensus, and what we did was we essentially went around the table, right, until people actually got comfortable. It took a lot of time, right, but until people got comfortable with the decision, and we never ever had to go to the vote, right, which was interesting, right, but for us it was kind of saying we got to get back to what these to our way sort of dealing with things and be serious about doing it that way. When I think about our AFOA programming, a lot of people say, okay, why should I take the AFOA programs as opposed to a university program? I said, well, it's about relating to the material, right? I mean, when I went through university, you're not you're always talking about widgets or whatever else. You're not talking about something that's relevant to the way you were brought up. And I'll never forget taking my first tax class. Well, forget it, right? I mean, because you never had to deal with that, right? But once you're able to relate to the material better, right, then you understand the concepts better.
Okay, we've got a question over
Yeah,
here.
just Tim Ribble, picking up on Peter's question about would we be ready, or would the nations be ready? Just a question to the other panelists, and Terry, you were just talking about it now, but what can the universities or academic institutions or civil society generally do to assist or support or empower Indigenous groups to be ready to be the nation in the nation to nation that's described there on that sheet?
Want me to go first? I think I just put another plug in for a capable and vibrant Aboriginal public service. We are First Nations in this country don't have access to much in the way of a First Nations civil society. So as a result, virtually all of the decisions that are made, even those that relate to the very practical elements of our lives, like health and water and housing, are all political decisions. We're an overly politicized group within the Canadian society, and so what we need to do is get back to supporting organizations that will help us, with research and evaluation and scientific ways of looking at those things that affect our lives, not necessarily seeing everything through a lens of rights and political decision. So I think what we've got to do is make the investments in Aboriginal public service, whether that's nationally or locally, at the band level or in larger national, political or provincial and national institutions. I think we have to make the investment in capacity development. But if we're going to move forward and be ready, we're going to have to think more about the nuts and bolts of our health and the nuts and bolts of our educational lives and our policies, rather than leaving this in the hands of our politicians.
Any other comments?
I think I'll just tackle a little bit different ways. So I happen to be also sit on the let's call it the technical group of the fiscal relations between the Crown and the Assembly of First Nations. And it's interesting having that conversation, and what Peter outlined, the thing about earlier, talking about sort of the transfer payments and so forth, is much of the discussion that we have at those tables, right? Because it's got to get to this notion of another order of government. I mean, it's interesting when I take a look at the transfer payments policy, is one thing that we had to comment on at AFO Canada. We did a focus group on that and a number of other ones. Is when you take a look at transfer payments policy, it's really it's about control versus, I guess you could say, citizen focus, right? And where's that balance? And certainly the Crown needs the control part, but it's at the same point, citizens have to have received that program or service, right? And it's all, and we went through the Blue Ribbon Task Force back in 2006. What we're saying at that time is that balance is heavily in the favor of the Crown, and you're not really, it's not really that client focused and recipient focused. And they're going to go through another round. Here's what they're doing, and we're saying we're still not there. You're still not. It's too tightly operated within these rules, these regulations, and that kind of stuff. And one of the issues is the actual funding authorities, right? Set, fixed, flexible, and all this other stuff. And when we were going through our focus group, what I did was I gave it all the INAC funding authorities, they set, fixed, flexible, blah. And then before people could read it, I went through the Health Canada ones, right? All this stuff. And I said, like, how are we expected to manage this? Like, you need a higher level of management capacity to be able to know all the different rules by the different departments, right? Which gets to this idea that there's got to be, that relationship is really key in terms of ensuring that the decision makers can meet the needs of what the ultimate citizen is, right? And the tightly controlled, things are just, it's gotta be. You need these people in communities to be able to make these decisions, have the flexibility to make these decisions according with community priorities. And I always mention the work that we did at the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, because what the AFOA, what we're saying is we got to move to a more flexible authority and arrangement, right, and more long term. But at the Healing Foundation, it was a conditional grant that the Healing Foundation was provided, right? And I also, and Mike could chime in on this, but the reason why the Healing Foundation was quite successful is we could adapt the work plan and the budget very quickly in terms of what the community wanted. There was a lot of innovation that was going on in those communities of what they wanted. And if it didn't particularly work in this, we could work with them quickly, change the work plan and the budget, and move to what would work in that particular community. And I thought, that's really what we have to get to, is that sort of notion, right? Of flexibility, being able to meet the ultimate client's needs. Now at AFO Canada, it's capacity development, right? That's what we building and that kind of thing. And keep in mind, in these communities, you have what I call, nobody wants to be categorized, and I'm not suggesting that, but for purpose of this discussion, I'll put it in these words, right? We have some challenged communities, and we have some very high performing. It's a huge spectrum, right? That's there, and we got to be able to recognize, that development that's got to happen at different levels, and even the high performing is how do you give it even further, right? So when we develop our products and that kind of stuff, we have that very much in mind, right? And we ended up creating these series of, like the HR series, the banking series, like the leadership series, to try to match as close as we can to the evolving nature of these communities. And I think another thing that I'm very mindful of when you're taking a look at that spectrum, and I also sit on reviewing proposals for the province of Ontario, and it's interesting because all of the high-performing communities always gets the funds, right? And why is that? It's because they have a higher level of management capacity. So they're able to do the proposals well. They're able to do all that stuff. And the challenged communities don't necessarily get the funds when they most need it, right? So the issue is, how do you ensure that you continue to build that, which may require a completely different strategy for some of these communities to get them out of the situation that they are. Otherwise, that wealth gap, what I call it, gets broader and broader, and then what happens, right? So,
I think just very briefly, I don't have another question. To what can folks do? But let me tell you, I think we're in a closing window of opportunity here. I think about even just starting at the Kelowna Accord and the settlement agreement to Harper and the omnibus bills and Idle No More and the failure of the Education Act, and to a federal election that had two major parties, being the NDP and the Liberals, really talking about some fundamental change on our issues. We had the TRC final report, which opened up a public narrative. We had a federal budget with $8.1 billion. We have an Indigenous cabinet minister. We have a president of a university here talking to us. We have Canadians having this conversation. This isn't going to last forever. Not every cabinet mandate letter is going to have a nation-to-nation reference in it. It simply will not. This next budget, I don't know if a public servant wants to correct me, probably won't have $8.1 billion in Indigenous investments in this budget as well. So our window's closing. And I think we got to make hay while the sun shines. We need to push Nipissing, we need to push our institutions and others to get ready for that question, because I think the TRC work and reconciliation work is important. I think the fundamental work is the nation-nation relationship building we have to do. So if we have a space and time here, let's make sure we're taking it.
Well, I'm on the side of hoping that our window isn't closing, but I think we have to act like it is, because there's some urgency to all of this. Last question.
Yeah.
we hear a lot of conversation. I think some of you mentioned it today. We need to get rid of the Indian Act. We need to get rid of the Department of Indian Affairs. What conditions precedent do you think are going to be necessary to start moving down that path?
Well, I think it's going to take a self-government framework that doesn't include extinguishment of Aboriginal title as a fundamental foundation. I think it's going to need resources for nations themselves to bring together the experts required to make the frameworks. I think it's going to take a federation that's willing to have the conversation about what division of powers will First Nations have.
Very well put.
And I would say, like, the Indigenous institutions are important to supporting the communities, right? So, you know, you have your institution there, Harold, and I have mine. But the Governance Center institution was a very important one, you know, and it's unfortunate that went on. And even the Statistical Institute is very important in terms of data, right? You can't create, like, you need data to develop and create policy, right? So good policy is what I think.
I think it just you mentioned the Governance Center, you mentioned the Statistical Institute, you mentioned the Healing Foundation, National Aboriginal Health Organization, all organizations dismantled shortly after the apology, and all national examples of civil society that we simply no longer have. So if we're going to move to this, to dismantle the Indian Affairs as we currently have it, or to take away the Indian Act, we have to be ready. And if we're going to be ready, we have to have an Aboriginal public service that can take that on.
Here, here.
Okay, with that, I want to draw this session to a close. I want to thank our three panelists very much.